Trisha Burnett gripped the steering wheel tighter, her heart racing. Months of undercover work, grueling nights, and a relentless pursuit of justice had led to this moment. She was closer than ever to dismantling one of the city's most dangerous cartels. And then, out of nowhere, red and blue lights shattered the night. Welcome to an incredible and teachable story. Here, we share captivating tales packed with life lessons to inspire and transform. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Tell us where you're watching from and the time right now in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. The city sprawled under a brooding sky, its jagged skyline softened by a shroud of low, heavy clouds. Rain clung to the windshield of her sleek SUV, refracting the glow of distant floodlights scattered across the dockyard. The air, thick with the salty tang of the nearby sea, carried faint whispers of industry. A forklift sputtering to life, workers exchanging low, hurried words in Spanish, and the faint creak of ropes straining under cargo weight. Trisha sat motionless, a watchful observer in the shadows. Below her vantage point, a group of men moved with calculated precision. Crates were unloaded from a battered truck, their contents hidden beneath layers of mundane produce. Suddenly, the lead figure cracked open a wooden container. The faint gleam of steel emerged, a shipment of rifles meticulously packed and ready for their grim purpose. Trisha's breath hitched, though her steady demeanor never faltered. She leaned slightly forward, her pulse a steady rhythm of resolve. Each click of her camera captured another piece of the puzzle, another thread in the web she'd been unraveling for months. A whispered command escaped her lips, barely audible over the ambient noise around her. A call to her team, ensuring the evidence wouldn't vanish into the night. The streets were deserted as Trisha drove away from the docks, her mind replaying the scene she had just witnessed. The evidence she'd collected tonight could dismantle one of the most dangerous cartels in the country. Her sleek black car cut through the wet pavement, the rhythmic sound of rain tapping against the windshield, a strange contrast to the pounding of her heart. The neighborhoods she passed were a patchwork of decay and resilience. Boarded up windows beside brightly lit corner stores, graffiti-covered walls proclaiming both defiance and despair. Trisha's focus never wavered. She knew the risks. When you got this close to the truth, danger was not a possibility, but a certainty. Then, like a jarring note in a melody, red and blue lights erupted in her rearview mirror. The sharp wail of a siren pierced the air, forcing her to slow down. Her stomach tightened, a familiar knot of frustration and caution. She pulled over, her hands steady on the wheel, the glow of the patrol car's headlights reflected in her side mirror, illuminating the raindrops clinging to her window. The officer stepped out, his movements deliberate and theatrical, as if he was playing to an invisible audience. Trisha didn't need to see his face to know what was coming. She had seen this before, driving while black, an age-old excuse for harassment. But this wasn't just harassment. This was something far worse. The officer reached her window, rapped on it sharply, and gestured for her to roll it down. The rain continued to fall, a steady rhythm against the tense silence. She complied, her badge already in her hand. "Evening, officer," she said, her voice calm but firm as she held up her identification. "I'm Agent Trisha Burnett, FBI." The man leaned down, his face finally visible under the harsh glow of the streetlights. His name tag read Joe. His expression was a mixture of disdain and smug satisfaction, the corners of his mouth curling into a smirk that made Trisha's skin crawl. "FBI, huh?" he drawled, taking the badge from her hand without bothering to look at it closely. He turned it over in his fingers, his lips twisting into a mockery of a smile. "Well, isn't that impressive?" He stepped back, straightening to his full height, his imposing frame silhouetted against the lights of his patrol car. The rain slicked his uniform, adding an almost theatrical sheen to his presence. "Step out of the car," he barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Trisha hesitated, her instincts flaring, but she knew better than to resist. Slowly she opened the door and stepped out, the cool rain immediately soaking through her jacket. Joe's eyes never left her, his gaze sharp and calculating. She stood tall, her FBI badge still in his hand. "I'm on official business," she said, her tone measured. "You're interfering with an ongoing federal investigation." Joe laughed, the sound cold and humorless. He waved the badge in the air like a prop in a cruel game. FBI? Don't make me laugh, he sneered, before shoving her badge into his pocket. Without warning, he grabbed her arm and forced her against the hood of her car. The cold metal pressed against her skin as he patted her down, his movements rough and unnecessary. You think that badge makes you untouchable? He said, his voice low and threatening. Out here, you're just another suspect. The rain fell harder now, each drop adding to the tension thickening in the air. Tricia remained silent, her mind racing. This wasn't just about harassment. Joe's actions were too deliberate, too calculated. He wasn't just flexing his authority, he was hiding something. The precinct loomed like a fortress of intimidation. Inside, the atmosphere was as cold as the rain-soaked streets outside. Harsh fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, illuminating scuffed tile floors and walls painted a lifeless gray. The air carried the sharp tang of bleach, mingled with the bitter aroma of coffee that had been left on the burner too long. Joe marched Tricia through the hallway, his grip firm on her arm, his face a mask of smug authority. Tricia kept her composure, her steps measured and steady, but her mind was racing. Every fiber of her being screamed that this wasn't a routine arrest. Joe's hostility felt personal, but why? The interrogation room was small and claustrophobic, its only furnishings a metal table and two mismatched chairs. One of the overhead lights flickered sporadically, casting jittery shadows on the walls. Joe shoved Tricia inside, the door slamming shut behind her with a metallic clang that echoed through the hall. He tossed her confiscated belongings onto the table, a phone, a wallet, and a small notepad, before leaning in close, his eyes narrowing. Don't get too comfortable, he said, his tone dripping with disdain. Without another word, he turned and left, locking the door behind him. The click of the lock was sharp, final. Tricia sat down slowly, the cold surface of the metal chair seeping through her damp clothes. Her eyes swept the room, noting the surveillance camera in the corner and the faint scratches etched into the tabletop, remnants of past struggles, forgotten stories. Outside, muffled voices filtered through the walls. The precinct hummed with activity, phones ringing, footsteps echoing in the hall, the occasional burst of laughter. But amidst the ordinary sounds, there were murmurs that stood out. Something's not right about this, a voice whispered. It was low but distinct. Keep it down, Nate, another voice replied, hurried and tense. No, seriously, Nate persisted. You saw her badge. She's FBI. What's Joe thinking? Bringing her in like this? You don't question Joe, the second officer said. Not unless you're looking for trouble. Tricia leaned back in her chair, her pulse quickening. She focused on the faint sounds outside, piecing together the fragments of conversation. Nate's voice carried a note of concern, a rare crack in the precinct's usual wall of silence. Her instincts sharpened. Joe's aggression wasn't just an abuse of power. It was calculated, deliberate. But why? What did he stand to gain? Minutes stretched into an uneasy silence. The air in the room felt heavier, the flickering light above her casting uneven shadows that seemed to pulse with the tension. Tricia's mind worked methodically, sorting through everything she knew about Joe, the precinct, and the cartel she was investigating. The pieces didn't fit. Unless a realization struck her, cold and sharp as the rain outside. Joe wasn't just a corrupt cop. He was involved. Somehow he was connected to the cartel she'd been chasing for months, and now he was trying to ensure she didn't get any closer to the truth. The door rattled, breaking her thoughts. Joe re-entered, his expression unreadable, but his posture brimming with suppressed intensity. He sat down across from her, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. Let's talk, he said, a sly grin creeping onto his face. Or we can do this the hard way. Tricia met his gaze head on, her resolve like steel. She didn't flinch, didn't speak. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. The room seemed to grow colder, the tension coiling tighter with each passing second. Outside the room, Officer Nate hesitated near the door, his face drawn with doubt. He knew the risks of getting involved. But as he listened to Joe's taunting tone, his conscience wrestled with his fear. Joe leaned back in his chair, tapping the table with deliberate slowness. Suit yourself, he said, rising to his feet. I'll give you some time to think about it. He left the room again, locking the door behind him. This time, Trisha caught the briefest glance between Joe and Nate as they passed in the hallway. Nate's eyes darted away, but not before Trisha saw the flicker of unease. Alone again, Trisha exhaled slowly, her mind racing. She wasn't just fighting for her freedom anymore. She was fighting for the truth, and she wasn't about to lose. The precinct was quieter now, its usual bustle subdued as the night deepened. The scent of cleaning chemicals hung heavier in the air, mingling with the faint metallic tang of rainwater tracked in from outside. The faint hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence, their dull glow reflecting off the worn linoleum floors. Inside the locked interrogation room, Trisha sat motionless, her mind a whirl of strategies and scenarios. She didn't flinch when the door creaked open, its hinges groaning in protest. Standing there was Nate, a wiry officer with kind eyes framed by deep worry lines. His brow furrowed as he glanced down the hallway, his nervous energy palpable in the way his fingers fumbled with the keys still hanging in the lock. He motioned for her to follow, his other hand resting lightly on the radio clipped to his belt. "We don't have much time." His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of urgency. Trisha didn't hesitate. She rose silently, her every movement calculated to avoid drawing attention. The corridor outside was dimly lit, the rhythmic hum of vending machines blending with the distant rumble of thunder. "Why are you helping me?" she asked quietly as they moved. Nate's expression darkened. "I've seen what happens to people Joe doesn't like," he said, his voice grim. "If you stay here, you'll disappear, just like the others." They passed the bullpen, its desks abandoned, except for a single officer dozing in his chair. Nate led her through a side door, pausing to disable the security camera with a flick of a switch hidden behind a panel. The click of the camera powering down echoed in the narrow hallway. "This way," he murmured, guiding her into the precinct's underground parking lot. The air here was cooler, tinged with oil and exhaust fumes. A lone fluorescent light flickered above an unmarked car parked in the corner. Nate unlocked the vehicle, his movements quick but deliberate. "Get in," he said, his voice taut with tension. Trisha slipped into the passenger seat, her senses on high alert. As Nate slid behind the wheel, he glanced around the lot, his sharp eyes scanning every shadow before starting the engine. The low hum of the motor came to life, its sound amplified in the cavernous space. They pulled out onto the rain-slicked streets, the car's tires hissing against the pavement. Nate's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles pale under the pressure. Trisha noticed the way his gaze flicked to the rearview mirror every few seconds, his unease palpable. The city stretched out before them, its towering buildings shrouded in mist. Neon signs reflected off puddles, their garish colors distorted by rippling water. The rhythmic patter of rain against the windshield provided a steady backdrop to the growing tension. "You're nervous," Trisha observed, her voice steady despite the chaos brewing inside her. "Joe's not the kind of man who lets things slide," Nate replied, his tone flat but heavy with meaning. "If he knows you're gone, he'll come after us." Trisha studied him for a moment, her sharp mind piecing together the fragments of information she had gathered. Joe's hostility, his insistence on bringing her in despite her credentials, and now Nate's fear. It all pointed to one thing. "Joe's involved," she said, the realization settling like a stone in her chest. Nate shot her a quick glance but said nothing. His silence was confirmation enough. Trisha leaned back in her seat, her mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. Joe wasn't just another corrupt cop flexing his power. He was tied to the cartel she had been tracking, and her investigation had come dangerously close to exposing him. "He's not just covering for someone," she continued, her voice low but firm. "He's in it. The cartel. That's why he wanted me out of the way." Nate's grip on the wheel tightened, his jaw clenching. "I didn't hear that," he muttered. Trisha didn't press him. She understood the danger he was in just by helping her. The road ahead stretched into darkness, the faint glow of streetlights their only guide. Rain streaked the windows, obscuring the view of the city's sleeping streets. As they approached an intersection, Nate slowed the car, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror again. "We need to find somewhere safe," he said, "somewhere Joe can't reach." Trisha nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. She knew she couldn't stay hidden for long. Joe wouldn't stop until he found her. but for now she needed to regroup, to plan her next move. The car turned onto a side street, its tires splashing through shallow puddles. The city loomed around them, a labyrinth of alleys and shadows. Somewhere in that maze, Joe was hunting them, and Tricia knew it was only a matter of time before he caught up. The interrogation room was empty, its single chair tilted at an angle that suggested hurried movement. The faint metallic scent of the room mixed with stale coffee from a forgotten cup on the desk. Joe stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame, his gaze fixed on the scene before him. His nostrils flared as he stepped inside, boots thudding heavily against the tiled floor. The vein in his temple pulsed visibly, his fists curling into tight knots. He turned on his heel, his breath coming in sharp, controlled bursts. "Where is she?" he growled, his voice a low rumble that silenced the few officers still lingering nearby. Outside, the precinct buzzed with activity, but Joe's fury cut through the noise like a blade. Phones rang incessantly, officers shuffled papers, but all movement seemed to halt when Joe stormed into the bullpen. "Get every available unit on this," he barked, his voice booming across the room. "Block every road out of this city. I want her found." The officers scrambled, their chairs scraping against the floor as they hurried to obey. Radios crackled to life, voices overlapping as dispatch relayed Joe's orders. The sound of slamming doors echoed through the precinct as a convoy of patrol cars roared to life outside, their engines revving in unison. Joe's face was a mask of controlled rage as he pulled out a burner phone from his pocket. He dialed a number, the motion quick and precise. "It's me," he said, his voice dropping to a cold, threatening tone. There was a pause as the person on the other end responded, their words inaudible over the background chaos. Joe's jaw tightened. "If she talks, we're all dead. Do you understand? I'll handle this myself." He ended the call with a sharp press of his thumb and tossed the phone onto his desk, its clatter lost in the flurry of activity around him. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, his heavy steps echoing in the hallway. Outside, rain continued to fall, the streets slick and gleaming under the dim glow of streetlights. Patrol cars fanned out in every direction, their lights casting flashes of red and blue against the buildings. The city was a maze, but Joe was determined to navigate it. "She can't have gone far," he muttered to himself, his voice like gravel. He climbed into his unmarked car, slamming the door shut. The engine roared to life, and he pulled onto the main road, his tires screeching against the wet pavement. The windshield wipers moved rhythmically, sweeping away the rain as Joe's sharp eyes scanned the streets. Every shadow, every passing car was a potential lead. His mind raced, piecing together where Tricia might have gone. Meanwhile, his radio crackled. "Unit 7 here. Negative on sightings at the south exit. Over." Joe grabbed the receiver. "Then check the east and double back to the industrial district. She's not getting out of this city." His voice was icy, each word laced with venom. His grip on the wheel tightened as he swerved onto a side street, his headlights cutting through the darkness. He knew this city better than anyone. It was his territory, his playground, and no one escaped him here. "You think you can outsmart me?" he muttered under his breath, a cruel smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. The rain intensified, pounding against the car's roof, drowning out the faint hum of the engine. But Joe was undeterred. He thrived in the chaos, his mind focused on one thing, finding Tricia and silencing her for good. At that moment, across town, Tricia and Nate had reached a small, dilapidated safe house. The building sat in a forgotten corner of the city, its exterior weathered by years of neglect. The windows were boarded up and the paint peeled in long strips, exposing the wood beneath. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of mildew. The single room was sparsely furnished, a battered sofa, a rickety table, and a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Nate locked the door behind them, his hands shaking slightly as he turned the key. "This place isn't much," he admitted, his voice low, "but it's off the grid. Joe won't find us here. At least not right away." Tricia scanned the room, her sharp eyes noting every exit, every potential weapon. She could feel the weight of her situation pressing down on her, but she forced herself to focus. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice steady. "Joe's not going to stop until he finds me. And when he does, we're both dead." Nate nodded, his expression grim. "Then we make sure he doesn't find us." Trisha's mind raced as she began formulating a plan. The safe house was far from ideal, but it would have to do. She knew Joe was out there, hunting her with the full force of his resources, and she knew she had to stay one step ahead. The rain continued to fall, its relentless rhythm a stark reminder of the storm closing in around them. The hideout was a forgotten relic, its metal walls streaked with rust and graffiti. The air inside was damp and heavy, carrying the stale scent of oil and decay. Moonlight seeped through shattered skylights, casting fragmented shadows across the floor, where shards of glass crunched beneath cautious footsteps. Trisha's breaths were controlled, though her chest tightened with the weight of her situation. She crouched near a stack of wooden crates, their edges splintered and jagged. In her hand, a burner phone flickered with a weak signal, barely enough to connect her to the outside world. "Come on," she whispered under her breath, her fingers dancing across the keypad. The screen glowed faintly, illuminating her determined expression. Across the room, Nate stood by a narrow window, his silhouette stiff against the dim light. His hand hovered near his holstered gun, the leather creaking softly as his fingers gripped it. He squinted into the darkness outside, scanning the desolate yard for any signs of movement. The sound of dripping water echoed faintly from a leaky pipe overhead. A rat scurried across the floor, its tiny claws scratching against the metal. But then a new sound emerged, footsteps crunching on gravel just beyond the warehouse. Nate's breath hitched, and he turned to Trisha, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone's out there." Trisha's gaze snapped up, her fingers freezing mid-dial. Her pulse quickened as she strained to listen. The footsteps grew louder, deliberate and unhurried, like a predator closing in on its prey. She motioned for Nate to stay low, her other hand instinctively reaching for the small knife tucked into her boot. The warehouse doors creaked, their rusted hinges groaning as they shifted slightly. The beam of a flashlight swept across the room, cutting through the darkness like a blade. Trisha ducked behind the crates, her body tensed. Joe, she thought, her jaw tightening. It had to be him. Outside, the footsteps paused, replaced by the faint murmur of voices. "Check the perimeter," barked a familiar voice, deep and commanding. Joe. Nate's eyes widened, and his grip on his gun tightened. Trisha met his gaze, her expression hard. "We can't wait for them to come to us," she mouthed silently. Nate nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. The pair moved like shadows, their steps careful and deliberate. Trisha gestured toward the far end of the warehouse, where a rusted fire escape led to the roof. If they could get above their pursuers, they might have a chance. The footsteps inside grew closer, the crunch of glass under boots sending shivers up Trisha's spine. She clenched her jaw, every muscle in her body coiled like a spring. Joe's voice echoed through the space. "You think you can run from me, Burnett? This ends tonight." The flashlight beam danced across the crates, just inches from where Trisha had been moments before. She and Nate reached the base of the fire escape, the metal ladder cold and slick beneath their hands. As they climbed, the sound of boots on metal rung out, a sharp, unmistakable warning. Joe's men had spotted them. "There, on the ladder," someone shouted. Gunfire erupted, the deafening cracks reverberating through the warehouse. Sparks flew as bullets ricocheted off the metal, showering the floor below. Trisha and Nate scrambled to the top, their breaths ragged as adrenaline coursed through their veins. On the roof, the air was cooler, the city lights twinkling faintly in the distance. But there was no time to marvel at the view. Trisha crouched low, scanning the surroundings for an escape route. "We need to split up," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. Nate hesitated, his face pale in the moonlight. "What if they catch you?" Trisha's eyes hardened. "They won't, and if they do, they'll regret it." Below, the warehouse was alive with activity. Joe's men fanned out, their flashlights sweeping across every corner. Joe himself stood in the center, his face a mask of fury. "Burnett," he bellowed, his voice cutting through the night. "You've got nowhere to go. Make this easy on yourself." But Trisha wasn't about to surrender. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let a corrupt cop take her down. She pointed to a distant alleyway, barely visible from their vantage point. "That's our way out. Go. I'll cover you." Nate nodded reluctantly, his movements hesitant as he began descending another fire escape. Trisha stayed behind, her knife in hand, her mind racing. She knew Joe wouldn't stop until he had her, or until she stopped him, and she was prepared to do whatever it took to survive. Joe didn't just want to arrest Trisha. No, this was far beyond a simple detainment. He wanted her gone, permanently. She was far too close to unraveling the secret he had worked so hard to bury. And if she stayed alive, his empire would come crumbling down. Trisha's heart hammered in her chest as she climbed down and crouched behind the stack of crates. Her fingers gripped the cold metal of the crate edges, her eyes darting toward the door as she heard Joe's footsteps nearing. Each heavy step echoed, a reminder of the beast hunting her down. The sound of Joe's voice rang out, low and cold. "You think you can hide from me, Burnett? You're just a nuisance. A loose end I'll tie up myself." A sharp click, the sound of Joe's gun being cocked, sent a jolt of dread through her veins. He was close, too close. She could hear his ragged breathing now, hear the tremor in his voice that spoke of desperation and fear. But Trisha had no intention of going down without a fight. As the door burst open with a deafening crash, Trisha moved with a fluidity that came from years of training. In one swift motion, she darted from behind the crates, her body a blur as she moved toward Joe, who stood just a few feet away. His gun was raised, but Trisha was faster. She slammed into him with the force of a tidal wave, knocking his weapon from his hand. It clattered to the floor, sliding several feet away. For a split second, Joe's stunned expression mirrored her own disbelief at how quickly things had escalated. But that hesitation was all Trisha needed. They collided, fists flying. Her training kicked in. Every punch, every strike aimed at disabling him. Her legs spun as she delivered a brutal roundhouse kick, landing squarely on his ribs. Joe staggered back, gasping for breath, but he was relentless. Joe's massive frame bore down on her, using his weight and strength to try and overpower her. He shoved her to the ground, his fists raining down in a flurry of blows. Each one felt like an explosion, pain radiating through her skull. But Trisha gritted her teeth, refusing to let him win. Her arms shot out, hands grabbing at his wrists as he pinned her to the cold, unforgiving floor. Blood trickled from a gash on her forehead, but she barely noticed. She could feel Joe's breath on her face, hot, rancid with fury. His eyes blazed with anger, but beneath it, Trisha saw something else. Fear. Fear that she would be the one to end him. With a swift motion, Trisha broke his hold on her arm, twisting it with a maneuver she had learned in countless training sessions. Joe howled in pain as she drove her knee into his side, forcing him off of her. The pain was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the adrenaline surging through her veins. She wasn't just fighting for survival now. She was fighting for justice. They both scrambled to their feet, the warehouse reverberating with their struggle. Joe lunged at her again, but Trisha was ready this time. She sidestepped his attack, using his own momentum to send him crashing into a stack of metal barrels. The loud clang of metal on metal reverberated through the space, signaling the momentary break in the fight. But only for a moment. Joe quickly recovered, his eyes burning with hatred. "You're a fool if you think you can stop me, Burnett," he snarled, wiping blood from his lip. "This is bigger than you. You have no idea what you're up against." The sirens outside grew louder, their wailing like the howl of an oncoming storm. Trisha's mind raced. What did he mean by bigger? Was this about the cartel, or was there something more? She didn't have time to process the question. All that mattered was getting out of there alive. But Joe wasn't about to let that happen. Joe lunged again, this time with a knife, a gleaming blade that caught the moonlight as it sliced through the air. Trisha barely managed to dodge, but the tip of the knife grazed her shoulder, tearing through her jacket and drawing blood. She retaliated, aiming a punch at Joe's jaw, but he blocked it with a ferocity that made her teeth rattle. They were locked in a vicious dance now, two warriors, determined to win. Trisha's thoughts raced as she fought. There had to be something more to Joe's connection to the cartel. Was he working with them? Was he the one pulling the strings behind the scenes? The pieces of the puzzle she had been piecing together for months were now beginning to snap into place. But before she could think any further, Joe shoved her back, sending her crashing into a wall. Dazed, she struggled to stand. She could hear the sirens now, close, too close. The screech of tires outside, the blare of sirens, louder and louder, until it almost drowned out everything else. Joe's face contorted in frustration, his chest heaving with rage. He wasn't about to be caught. Not now. With one last desperate roar, Joe lunged at her, but as he did, he froze, his expression shifting from anger to confusion. The faintest sound of sirens could be heard from outside, growing nearer. Trisha's heart raced. Help was coming, but it was too late for Joe. He knew that. The sirens were deafening now, closing in on them. Trisha's breath caught in her throat as Joe hesitated, his expression flickering with doubt. He turned to glance toward the door, and in that split second, Trisha made her move. She ducked low, using her legs to sweep his feet out from under him. Joe crashed to the ground with a grunt, momentarily stunned. Before he could recover, Trisha darted for the door, her mind focused on one thing: escape. But as she reached the threshold, she looked back once more. Joe was scrambling to his feet, his eyes wild with fury. But Trisha didn't wait. She bolted into the night, her heart pounding as distant sirens grew louder. She had to survive. For herself, for the truth, and for everyone else who had been silenced by men like Joe. Joe stood frozen, his fists still clenched, his breath coming in heavy, ragged gasps. His eyes were wide with a mixture of rage and fear, the weight of impending consequences settling in as the sirens grew louder. For the first time, doubt crossed his mind, doubt about his own invincibility. The empire he had so carefully constructed, built on lies, corruption, and violence, was now on the brink of unraveling. The sirens blared like a warning, their shrill wail cutting through the tension. The screeching of tires followed as several patrol cars skidded to a halt outside. Voices shouted orders from a distance, and the unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps filled the air, signaling the arrival of backup. Joe had always believed he was untouchable, above the law, above reproach, but as the sirens closed in, his empire, the one he thought would protect him, began to crumble. The realization hit him like a cold wave. The game was over. Joe's eyes darted toward the exit, panic flashing across his face. With one last glance at Trisha, he spun on his heel and bolted into the shadows, disappearing into the night. For a moment, Trisha stood still, the weight of everything that had just happened crashing down on her. Her clothes were torn, her face bruised and bloodied, but her eyes burned with an unyielding fire. She had survived. She had fought back. As backup flooded the warehouse, Trisha straightened, the blood trickling down from a cut on her lip, only adding to the defiance in her gaze. She was exhausted, battered, and bruised, but she was still standing. She looked toward the officers now entering, their guns drawn, their eyes scanning the room for any sign of danger. But it was too late. Joe was already gone. Trisha's eyes flickered toward the door, the path Joe had taken to escape, but she made no move to follow him. Instead, she turned as if she could feel the weight of someone watching. She gave a faint, bloodied smile, the edge of her resolve unshaken. "This isn't over," she muttered, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. The words hung in the air, pregnant with the promise of what was to come. Trisha had made it out, but the war was just beginning. Joe's betrayal was only the surface of something much darker, and she knew, deep in her gut, that the truth was even more dangerous than she had imagined. Now she had a choice: to chase down Joe and bring him to justice, or to dive deeper into the web of corruption that stretched far beyond the reaches of this city. But in that moment, as the night air rushed in and the chaos unfolded around her, one thing was certain. No matter where the path led, Trisha was ready, and she wasn't going to stop until every last secret was exposed.